But I suppose looking back at the SHD process, was it a success in your opinion? Obviously, it was brought in 2017 to fast track housing. We desperately need housing. There's a bit of a housing crisis going on in Ireland, especially Dublin. You hear all the stories of people trying to buy houses, and it's next to impossible at the moment. So, do you think it was a success, or was it a bit of a flop and a failure, the SHD process?
I wouldn't say it was a flop and a failure, but I think on paper again, and that's why I've said it on paper, this new large scale residential development road that we will use for large scale developments looks on paper to be good. But the SHD looked on paper to be good, but then a loophole was found with JRs, and that's caused a massive problem with SHDs. So I think in principle it was very good. There's very mixed opinions as to whether it was successful or not, or whether it sped up the process. The JR system, the JR problems around SHDs definitely caused massive delays. You know, once you get a leave for JR, you can be up to, a developer can be up to a year waiting to get to court in order to argue it and to get a decision on the JR, and whether the JR is upheld and the development quashed, or whether it's rejected and the development is granted. So like that's a year that can be waiting for a large development. So from that perspective, the JRs have massively held up things, and there's been a huge success rate with leave for JRs. So I think it's up over 90% if you on developments that have been given. So you apply for a leave for JR. So if you've got a development and you're objecting against it on the grounds on the judicial review, asking for judicial review, you ask for the leave for JR. If that's granted by the judge, you then could be 12 months, up to 12 months waiting to have a hearing. And I think the success rate is over 90% for those leave for JR. So that's absolutely massive, you know. And I think you had the stats earlier about the amount of SHDs that have fallen foul of this, you know. So do I think it's been a success? I don't know. I honestly don't know. It definitely was. It was a vehicle for it to be a success, but I think you'll find the vast majority of people are going to say it hasn't been a success.
Yeah, on that, a quick stat on what's been delivered. So out of 210 SHDs granted permission, only 72 of them, so roughly a third, proceeded to construction since 2017.
Yeah, now in fairness, that stat there, like that's a huge stat. Like if you take the JR out of that, that's still very low numbers actually breaking ground. But it'd be interesting to know in the 2/3 that haven't hit ground, why they haven't hit ground. Is it because the vast majority are tied up in legal issues, or is it to do with funding, or is it to do with holding on to land, like developers getting planning, holding on to land, looking at flipping the land for a better price because they've taken the risk of getting planning, spent the money, and now they're going to flip it. So it'd be interesting to know what that 2/3 is made up of. I'd imagine a good portion of it is to do with legal reviews on developments, you know, because that has been a huge talking point over the last number of months, and in particular for us around daylight sunlight. You know, that the goalposts have literally moved from one side of the pitch to the other with daylight sunlight and methodology, and what was acceptable in terms of methodology say 12 months ago is no longer acceptable now because of decisions over the last 6 to 9 months with regard to schemes. So we've been kind of with daylight sunlight, which is a very technical area of planning, that's now under the spotlight. It's one of the go-to documents for planning, and that's we need to make sure that we're covered in what we do, and we're very good at what we do. But it is a real challenge, and it feels I feel like we've been on floating ice with daylight sunlight because of JR and because of how things have changed over the last 9 to 12 months. It has been, you know, it's sort of like a big sheet of ice that's breaking and you're jumping from one piece to the next. So it has been challenging. That's only one element of planning. So you can imagine a planning consultant and they have to be having an overriding view of all areas of the planning, including daylight sunlight. So it's been very challenging for them as well. So I think if the JOR element can be fixed, I don't think it'll be fixed properly, but if they do get the legislation through that removes this administrative error issue away from it, and that you have to have more substantial grounds for asking for leave for JOR, I think that'll make a huge difference, much more so than switching from an SHD process to large-scale residential development process.